No one could read it. That was what more than 20 renowned cryptographers had been forced to admit after years of studying the family codex of the DeLuca Mafia empire. It was believed that hidden within those strange symbols lay a secret capable of changing the fate of the entire family. And yet, on the very day when the young Don Lorenzo DeLuca had almost given up all hope, a 3-year-old girl, the daughter of the housekeeper, unexpectedly walked into the library, looked at the codex, and innocently said, "I can read it." 7 minutes later, the first lines of the code were deciphered, unlocking a secret that had been buried for more than half a century and igniting a chain of betrayal, conspiracy, and a bloody war that could wipe out the entire DeLuca empire. The rain came down in heavy sheets against the tall windows of the DeLuca library, turning the late autumn afternoon into something closer to dusk. The estate on the outskirts of New York had known many kinds of silence over the past century, but the silence inside that library, only 2 weeks after Don Matteo DeLuca had been laid in the family crypt, was of a different kind. It was not the silence of grief. It was the silence of men waiting to see who would move first. The fire in the marble hearth burned low, casting amber light across the walnut floor and the tall bookshelves that reached almost to the coffered ceiling. Between the shelves stood dark oil portraits of men who had built the family from nothing more than iron will and old debts. In the center of the long table, resting on a folded square of black velvet, sat the leather-bound codex, its brown cover worn smooth by the hands of 5 generations. Lorenzo DeLuca stood at the head of the table with one hand on the back of his father's chair. He had not yet chosen to sit in it. At 34, he wore mourning well, but he did not wear it easily. His dark suit was cut sharp, his jaw sharper, and the small silver crucifix his mother had pressed into his palm at the funeral now sat inside his breast pocket, warm against his chest. Alberto Fanti, the family lawyer, adjusted his glasses and lifted the sealed envelope for the 3rd time that hour. His voice was steady, careful, and old. Don Matteo left one final condition: gentlemen. It was written in his own hand and witnessed by 2 priests. He paused, letting the words settle. Lorenzo is to be recognized as the lawful heir only when the family codex has been deciphered. Marco DeLuca leaned back in his chair with a bitter laugh. A joke from a dead man. That is what we are handling now. He was younger than Lorenzo by 4 years and had never learned to lose gracefully. 20 experts, 20 years. And he wants us to wait for the book to open itself. Isabella DeLuca Moretti pressed her fingertips against her temple. Her black dress was still the one she had worn to the burial. If the codex is not read, the family will split. The captains are already speaking of choosing sides. Near the liquor cabinet, Sebastian Ricci stood without moving. 72 years old. His hands were folded behind his back in the posture of a man who had spent his entire life waiting to be told what to do. His face gave nothing away, though his eyes were fixed on the codex with an intensity that no one in the room bothered to notice. A soft knock came at the double doors. Sophia Carter entered with a silver tea tray, her steps quiet, her eyes lowered as befitted a woman only 3 days into her new position. Behind her, holding the hem of her mother's skirt with one small hand, came Emma. The girl was 3 years old. In her other arm she carried a bear whose fur had lost its color long before she was born. Emma saw the codex. Her eyes widened. She let go of her mother's skirt and walked toward the table. "Emma." Sophia's whisper was sharp with fear. "Come back, sweetheart." But Emma stopped in front of the table and lifted her face to the man at the head of it. Her voice was small, clear, and completely out of place in the DeLuca library. "I can read it." The room froze. The fire seemed to pause. Lorenzo lowered his eyes to the child, and when he spoke, the words came measured and cold. "Emma, you're too young. This isn't a game, and I am not a man who plays them." Marco laughed under his breath, the sound of a man who had just been given permission to feel superior again. Sophia stepped forward, her face gone pale beneath her dark hair, and reached for her daughter's shoulder. Alberto Fanti did not lift his eyes from the child. He set the sealed envelope down on the table with the same deliberate care he had used to lift it, and when he spoke, his voice carried the calm of a man who had spent his life measuring words against consequences. "Don Lorenzo," he said, "a single sheet of paper will not change the order of these proceedings, and if the child speaks nothing, we will have lost only 1 minute of an afternoon that already belongs to the dead." Isabella turned toward him sharply. Her mourning veil trembled at her shoulder. "Alberto, this is a family matter. It is not a place for children and outsiders. Whatever grief has done to us, it has not undone the walls of this house. With respect, Signora Moretti," the lawyer answered. "The walls of this house have already been opened by a will. What remains of them can survive 1 more minute." Lorenzo said nothing. He looked at Emma, then at her mother. Sophia had gone very still, her hand hovering just above her daughter's shoulder, as though she did not quite know whether to pull her back or let her stand. Lorenzo had spent enough of his life reading faces to know that the fear on Sophia's face was not the fear of a mother whose child had misbehaved. It was the fear of a woman who had seen the child do this before and did not yet know what it would cost her. He lifted one hand and made a small motion with 2 fingers. Permission. Sebastian moved before anyone else did. From the writing desk near the window, he retrieved a sheet of cream-colored stationery and a black fountain pen. Then, after a pause so brief that only Sophia caught it, he set the fountain pen down and picked up a pencil instead. He brought both the paper and the pencil to Emma with the quiet gravity of a man setting out instruments for a rite he did not wish to insult. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. There had been no reason for a butler to know that a 3-year-old girl would find ink too permanent for the marks she was about to make. And yet he had known. Emma took the pencil in her small hand. Sebastian pulled out a tall chair and set it before the table. She climbed onto it with the seriousness of a scholar taking her place at an altar. Her shoes could not reach the rung, and the old bear was left beside the pencil, watching. She bent over the paper. For a moment, the only sounds in the room were the scratch of graphite and the rain against the tall windows. When she straightened, she turned the sheet so that the men could see it. 5 symbols had been drawn in, careful, unadorned strokes. A curved shape like the neck of a bird bent backward, a circle with 2 dots beside it, a small arch beside a straight line, a star, and 3 dots arranged in a tiny triangle. Emma pointed to the first mark with the tip of the pencil. "This one means watch," she said. Grandpa said when a bird looks behind itself. The writer didn't trust what was coming next. She moved her finger to the second symbol. "The circle with the dots means don't read straight. Read around it. The real sentence is hiding beside the sentence. Then the arch. This one is a key. Not the kind for a door. It's the truth you need before something opens. Then the star. This one is a name that isn't written. The writer knew the person, but he didn't want strangers to know. And finally, the 3 dots. This means there is another meaning under the first meaning, so the words that look plain are not plain." Marco snorted from the far end of the table. "Charming. Someone taught her a bedtime story." But Alberto Fanti had leaned forward, and his silence was of a different kind. Lorenzo looked at Emma now with an expression his sister had never seen him wear before. It was not the softness of pity. It was the attention of a man who had spent his life among liars, and who knew the shape of what could not be faked. Emma set the pencil down beside the bear. She did not reach for the pages of the codex. She reached instead for the cover. Her small hand rested on the worn brown leather, and her fingers traced something the men in the room could not yet see. "The real ones are here," she said. "Not inside." Alberto Fanti's mouth opened, then closed. The old lawyer had spent 7 years of his career trying to break the codex on behalf of Don Matteo, and before him, another 11 on behalf of Don Alessandro. 23 specialists in 5 countries, 2 priests from a Vatican archive, a retired officer of naval intelligence who had refused payment. Not one of them, in all those years, had ever asked to look at the cover. He stared at Emma, as though she had just spoken a language he had heard only in dreams. Sebastian, standing again by the liquor cabinet, allowed his face to arrange itself into the appropriate expression of mild butlerly surprise. Inside his chest, something very old and very cold began to turn over. He knew what was on that cover. He had seen Don Alessandro run his thumb along it once, 67 years ago, in the corridor outside a nursery from which a 5-year-old boy was about to be taken away forever. The boy had watched from behind a door that was not quite closed. The boy had remembered. Emma pointed with the tip of one small finger. "Here, near where the pages join, the watching bird, and here, in the corner, the 3 dots, and under this strip of leather, where the belt sits, the arch, the key of the truth." Lorenzo leaned forward. He drew the desk lamp closer, turned its brass shade to a low angle, and tilted the codex under the light. At first he saw nothing, only the smooth brown grain of leather that had been touched by 5 generations of De Luca hands. Then, as he adjusted the angle by no more than the width of a finger, the marks emerged, faint, worn nearly to nothing by decades of thumbs and rain-damp gloves, and the soft handling of men who had believed the secret lay behind the cover rather than upon it. A curved neck. A cluster of 3 tiny points. An arch, almost invisible, only revealed because the leather had been pressed deeper than the surrounding grain. Lorenzo did not speak for a long moment. He simply looked. Isabella came around the table without seeming to notice she had moved. She bent over the light. Her hand rose to her mouth. "How did we never see this?" she said. And it was not really a question. All these years. How did we never see it? Emma answered her in the plain, unhurried tone of a child who did not yet know that plainness was itself a kind of accusation. "Because you only looked in the middle. Grandpa said that, He said the proud ones only look in the middle. Marco's face turned the color of wine held too close to a candle. He opened his mouth to say something and closed it again without saying it. At the head of the table, Lorenzo let out a breath that was almost a laugh. It was the first sound close to laughter that anyone in the DeLuca library had made since the funeral. And it came, of all things, at the expense of his own family. Sebastian did not move. His hands remained folded behind his back, but under his stiff, white cuffs, the old man's fingers had curled into the beginning of a fist, and then, with the same practiced discipline that had carried him through 60 years of service, opened again into stillness. Lorenzo straightened. He looked at the child seated on the tall chair, at the pencil beside the bear, at the marks she had drawn and the marks she had found. "Let her read the first page," he said. Alberto Fanti's pen was already moving. Emma turned the first page of the codex with both hands. The paper was thick, old, and slightly warm where the desk lamp had touched it. She did not begin at the top left, where a grown reader's eye would naturally settle. She placed her small finger in the outer margin of the page, low and to the right, where a cluster of tiny marks had been drawn so lightly that they seemed at first to be flaws in the paper. She traced them upward, then across, then back down the opposite margin, in the reverse direction of ordinary reading. Alberto Fanti's pen moved beside her, silent as breath. He had abandoned his notes on the will entirely. A fresh sheet lay open, and every word Emma spoke, he wrote. "The one at the corner says watch," Emma said quietly. "Then this one says where's. Then this one, family, then face, then the arch, which means the key, but here it means serves. And the last one on this side is house." She lifted her head and read the sentence she had gathered, in a voice small but clear enough that not a single syllable was lost to the rain. "Watch the one who wears the family face and serves as if the house were his." The library did not so much fall silent as freeze. Even the fire, which had been burning steadily for hours, seemed to hold itself in. Marco stood up so fast his chair scraped the walnut floor. The sound was raw and unlovely, and it made Isabella flinch. "What is this?" he demanded. "Someone scribbled nonsense 100 years ago to make us suspect each other, and we are going to sit here and let a housekeeper's child read it out like scripture?" No one answered him. Isabella's eyes moved, not by decision but by reflex, toward the liquor cabinet. Sebastian stood there as he had stood there for the entire afternoon, head slightly bowed, hands folded now before him at his waist in the posture of a butler awaiting instructions. His face gave away nothing at all, and that, Isabella thought without knowing why, was the first thing she had ever found strange about him. Emma placed her finger on the next line. She traced, she lifted, she spoke. The first theft was not of gold, but of name. Lorenzo felt a cold move slowly up the back of his neck and settle at the base of his skull. He had buried his father 62 days ago. The physician who had come to the house that night had said the words heart attack with the practiced ease of a man who had said them many times before, and he had said them again, more slowly. When Lorenzo had asked how a man of 62 who ran 3 miles every morning and drank only water at supper could be dead before the second course reached the table, the physician had not been able to answer. He had only lowered his eyes. Lorenzo had not thought of that lowered gaze in weeks. It came back to him now. Sophia had crossed the room without anyone noticing. She stood at the tall chair with her hand on Emma's shoulder, gently helping her daughter climb down. The bear was tucked once again into the crook of the child's arm. Emma looked tired the way small children look tired, suddenly and completely, like a candle beginning to gutter. Lorenzo did not look at his brother, or at his sister, or at the lawyer whose pen had finally stopped moving. He looked at Sebastian. "Sebastian," he said, "how long have you served this family?" Sebastian answered without hesitation, with the smoothness of a man who had rehearsed the sentence for so long that it had stopped feeling like an answer and had become instead a kind of prayer. 60 years, Don Lorenzo. Since I was 5, Emma rested her hand on the codex once more. She did not sit down in the tall chair again. Sophia held her from behind, one arm around her waist, the way a mother holds a child who is not yet finished with something the mother wishes had never begun. "There is one more line on this page," Emma said. "It says where." She traced the marks in the lower margin. Her finger moved slowly. When she lifted her head, her eyes were on the window rather than on any face in the room. "The Eastern Hall," she said, "where the founder still watches." Alberto Fanti wrote the words down and let his pen rest at last. He looked up at Lorenzo, and in the small movement of his old shoulders there was something close to apology, as though he had personally failed the codex by never asking it the correct question. Lorenzo did not turn his head. "Sebastian," he said, "the key." For the first time in 60 years, Sebastian did not answer at once. The pause was short, no longer than the space between 2 beats of a clock, but it was there. Isabella heard it. Alberto heard it. Lorenzo heard it as clearly as if the old man had spoken aloud. Sebastian reached into the inside pocket of his black butler's coat. His hand did not tremble in any way a stranger would have noticed, but his own fingers, which had polished silver and folded linens and buttoned the collar of a 5-year-old boy who would one day become Don Lorenzo, knew perfectly well that they were shaking. He drew out a small iron key, worn dark by decades of pocket cloth. He placed it on the tray. Alberto Fanti extended. "The Eastern Hall has not been opened since Don Alessandro was laid to rest," Sebastian said. His voice was the same voice he had used for 60 years. "In 2004, if I recall correctly." "You recall correctly," Lorenzo said. The corridor beyond the library was longer than any of them remembered. The wall lamps along its length were bronze, tarnished dark by the weather that seeped through the estate's old windows every winter. And only every second one had been kept alive. The light came in slow yellow pools that did not quite meet each other along the floor. Sophia lifted Emma into her arms before they set out. The child was too tired to walk, and the hall was too cold, and no housekeeper in her right mind was going to let her 3-year-old daughter's shoes touch a stone that had not been swept in 20 years. Emma laid her cheek against her mother's shoulder and kept her eyes open. The portraits watched them pass. Don Vittorio, 1901, in the uniform of a captain of the old country. Don Alessandro, 1932, in a gray suit and a pearl gray cravat, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the frame. Don Matteo, 2004, still recent enough that Isabella turned her face away as they passed. Between each portrait, a small brass plaque and a date. Between each date, a life. Emma lifted her head. "Stop, please," she said, and Sophia stopped. The child was looking at Don Alessandro. The portrait showed a man in middle age. One hand rested on a table, and on that table lay a leather-bound book with a brown cover, exactly the color of the codex, now lying on the walnut desk behind them. The other hand bore a signet ring of dark gold, and even at that painter's distance, the letters engraved on its face were legible. A.D. Emma studied it. Then she pointed to the lower right corner of the heavy gilded frame. "This one has been opened before." Alberto Fanti and Lorenzo stepped closer. Alberto raised the small pocket flashlight he had begun to carry since the funeral. The dust along the top of the frame lay in a thick, undisturbed velvet. The dust along the lower right corner did not, and there, half hidden beneath the ornamented gold, a small nail sat brighter than the others, its head unscratched, its fitting a shade too new. Behind them, Sebastian stood very still. In the yellow light, his face had gone the color of old paper. Isabella whispered, almost to herself, "This is the corridor Father would not let us enter as children. A house remembers what its people choose to forget." Lorenzo did not look away from the frame. "Take it down," he said. Sebastian moved at once. His hand was already reaching for the lower edge of the gilded wood when Lorenzo's voice stopped him without ever needing to rise. "Not you, Sebastian. Alberto." The old man's hand paused in midair, then withdrew. He stepped back one measured pace and folded his hands before him again in the posture of a servant awaiting further orders. His face gave away nothing. His eyes did. Alberto Fanti drew a pair of thin cotton gloves from his coat pocket, the sort he had once used to handle Don Matteo's oldest deeds. One of Lorenzo's guards stepped in silently to steady the far side of the frame. Together, with the care of men handling something that might have opinions of its own, they lifted Don Alessandro's portrait from the wall. The wall behind it was not a wall. The plaster had been cut and refitted with the patience of a craftsman who had believed no one alive would ever come looking. A shallow niche opened into the stone, its edges softened by the same dust that had lain along the top of the frame. Inside, 3 things lay side by side, arranged with the quiet ceremony of a man placing offerings on an altar: a letter, sealed with red wax that had cracked into 3 uneven pieces, a small book bound in black leather, its cover dry with age, and a folded map of the estate, its paper yellowed at the creases. Alberto reached in slowly. He lifted the letter first. The envelope was thick, handmade, and along its face a line had been written in old ink by a hand that had steadied itself with effort. He read it aloud, in the voice a lawyer reserved for things older than the room he stood in. "To the DeLuca who is still willing to bear the truth." Isabella made a small sound in her throat. Sophia tightened her hold on Emma. Marco did not speak. "Read it, Alberto," Lorenzo said. The old lawyer turned the envelope, broke the remaining wax with the edge of his thumb, and drew out a single folded page. He read slowly, and his voice, though steady, took on the gravity of a man carrying something heavier than paper. "I write these lines not to shame the house I built, but so that the house will not forget that it was built upon the shoulders of a child I denied. I once had a son, my firstborn. His mother was not of our blood, and for the honor of the family I sent him away when he was 5 years old. That has been the greatest sin of my life. If anyone reads these words, I beg you, restore to him the name I stole. Don Alessandro De Luca, 1998. The letter came to rest in Alberto's gloved hand. The corridor did not move. Isabella covered her face with both hands and wept without sound. She had never met her grandfather, only his portraits and his silences, and both had raised her. Marco shook his head slowly, again and again, as though the motion itself might undo what had been said. Impossible, he whispered. Not him, not grandfather. In the corner beyond the light, Sebastian stood so still that his stillness had become its own kind of confession. Inside the pocket of his black coat, his hand had closed around a small wooden crucifix, olive wood worn smooth by 60 years of thumb and prayer, the last thing his mother had pressed into his palm before the fever had taken her. He held it now with a grip that would have broken a lesser thing. Lorenzo did not go to him. He did not accuse him. He did not speak at all. He only looked, for a long time. Alberto Fanti laid the letter gently on the small marble side table beneath the empty frame, as though the paper itself now required a place to rest. He lifted the black leather book from the niche next, and turned it toward the yellow lamplight. The cover gave off a faint smell of cedar and old cloth. When he opened it, the pages inside were ruled and dated, and the hand that had filled them was the same hand that had signed the letter. Not a diary, a ledger. He turned the pages slowly, then he turned them more slowly still. 1958, he read. Tuition, $142. Rent, private residence, Brooklyn. Payment sent through third intermediary. Recipient, Caterina Ricci. Child noted only by initials, S. R. He turned another page, then several. The entries were meticulous. Monthly, unbroken, 1962. Medical, $38. Winter clothing, 12. Recipient, Caterina Ricci. Child, S. R. Another page, 1971. Secondary school fees, Caterina Ricci. S. R. The years moved forward under Alberto's gloved thumb. 40 years of entries. 40 years of a household that had never appeared on any tax return, on any deed, on any Christmas card. 40 years of a name pressed down onto paper by a hand that had refused to write it in full. Alberto stopped near the middle of the book. His mouth opened, closed, and opened again. Ricci, he said quietly. It was not a question. It was the sound of a word arriving. Isabella turned her head. She did not think about turning it. She simply turned, and her eyes found Sebastian across the corridor, in the corner where the lamp did not quite reach. Marco's brows drew together in the slow, delayed frown of a man whose mind had begun to move ahead of his willingness to follow it. Lorenzo turned last, without haste, in the manner of a man who had already known where his gaze would end. Sebastian did not shift. His hands were folded before him again. His face wore the same practiced composure it had worn since the codex had first been opened. There are many Ricci in this country, he said, gentlemen and ladies. His voice was even, rehearsed. The sentence had been carried inside him for so many years that it no longer had a shape of its own. It was the answer of a man who had prepared, decades ago, for the moment when this question might finally be asked, and who had continued to prepare long after he had ceased to believe it would come. But Emma, who did not know the politics of grown men, who did not know what a ledger was, who was 3 years old and tired and warm in her mother's arms, lifted her head from Sophia's shoulder and looked at Sebastian for a long moment. Then she leaned toward her mother's ear. That uncle has sad eyes, Mama. The whisper was not soft enough. It carried in the still air of the corridor the way a small stone carries in a well. Sebastian flinched. It was almost invisible, but it was the first involuntary movement his body had made since the morning began, and every adult in the corridor saw it. Alberto turned to the final written page. 1998, he read, and his voice thinned. The child is now a man. I have not the courage to return the name. God forgive me. The lamp behind him buzzed faintly and steadied. Lorenzo did not accuse. He did not move. He only looked at Sebastian, and he looked for a very long time. They returned to the library because the corridor had begun to feel too narrow for what had been said in it. Alberto laid the ledger and the letter on the walnut table beside the codex, and he unfolded the last item from the niche. The map, with the delicate patience of a man handling something that had been folded by hands now dead. The paper was drawn by hand. The lines were done in fine black ink, sharpened at the corners where a draftsman's ruler had held. In the lower right, a small notation in faded pencil read simply, 1954. Emma had not asked to be set down. She only looked. Sophia lowered her to the tall chair beside the table. and the child placed her small hand on the corner of the map, as though asking it something private. "This is not our house," Emma said. "It is," Lorenzo answered. "But it was drawn before your mother was born." Emma traced a line with her finger. The estate on the paper was smaller than the one they lived in now. There was no east wing. The chapel had not yet been built. The orchard ran farther west than any of the DeLuca children had ever seen, and behind it, drawn with fewer lines because it had once mattered less, sat a small square building at the edge of the olive grove. A tiny mark had been added in dark red ink beside it. The ink was newer than the map. The mark was a small square, and beside it, in the same careful hand that had written the letter and kept the ledger, 4 words. "Where memory is buried." Isabella read the words aloud. Her voice did not shake, but something behind it did. Marco pushed away from the table. "We cannot go out there. Not now. It is raining. It will be dark within the hour, and we are chasing a 3-year-old's game across a garden that has not been walked in for decades. Enough. Enough of this." Isabella did not turn to him. She turned instead toward the wall, where a smaller portrait of her father hung above the sideboard, painted less than 2 years ago, the paint still bright enough to make grief feel indecent. "If our father died for this," she said softly, "we have to know." Marco opened his mouth. He closed it again. Lorenzo did not raise his voice. He never had needed to. "Bring the coats," he said, "and 2 flashlights." The house began to move around him. A guard was sent for lanterns, another for the heavy oilcloth coats that had been kept in the mudroom since Don Mateo's hunting days. Sebastian stepped forward. He inclined his head with the same precise angle he had used for 60 years, and he spoke with the same clean, contained tone. "I have known the olive grove since I was a child, Don Lorenzo. I can lead the way." "Do that," Lorenzo said. He held the old man's eyes a moment longer than he had ever held them before. Sebastian did not look away, but he did not look back with the same eyes he had used that morning either. Both men understood, without words, that the polite fiction that had governed their relationship for 3 decades had begun to loosen at one of its seams. Sophia knelt beside her daughter. "Sweetheart, you stay with Signora Isabella. Mama will come back very quickly." Emma took her mother's hand and held it with the seriousness of an adult. "I have to go, Mama. The book is not finished." Alberto Fanti gathered the letter, the ledger, and the map into his leather case with careful, exact hands. The rain had turned finer by the time they crossed the terrace and stepped down into the garden, though the cold had not thinned with it. It settled in the collars of their coats and drew a slow silver haze across the olive grove. The trees were old, their trunks bent in the direction of a wind that no longer blew. Between them, half sheltered by a rise in the ground and half surrendered to it, stood the old storehouse. Its roof had lost tiles to more than one winter. Its wooden door had darkened from age into something closer to bark. The path leading to it had not been swept in the memory of anyone still living in the house. Sebastian walked ahead of the group with the steadiness of a man who did not need light to find a place. His black butler's coat had already begun to darken along the shoulders with rain. He pushed the door open with 2 fingers, as though it were the door to a bedroom where someone was still sleeping, and stepped inside. He crossed to the far corner of the brick floor. He did not kneel. He only pointed. "This corner has a different echo," he said. "It always did." Marco took the crowbar from a guard's hand. He hesitated. Then he set the iron to the seam of the bricks and pushed his weight against it. The mortar gave way with the dry protest of a thing that had waited a long time to be asked. One brick lifted, then another. Beneath them lay a thick wooden hatch, its planks dark and swollen, its iron ring dulled by decades of undisturbed silence. The hatch opened onto a narrow stone stairway, and the air that rose out of it was older than any of them. It smelled of earth. It smelled of paper. It smelled of a cold that lived under houses and did not answer to seasons. Lorenzo went down first with a flashlight in his left hand. Alberto Fanti followed, his leather case pressed against his ribs. Sophia stopped at the top of the steps, Emma in her arms, and did not attempt to descend. The child leaned forward, curious, but did not ask to be let down. The chamber below was small, barely wider than a corridor. A tin trunk sat against one wall. Beside it lay 2 ledger books wrapped in gray cloth, and on top of the ledgers, wrapped separately in a square of green velvet that had once been fine, rested a framed photograph. Alberto lifted the frame with both gloved hands. He set the flashlight on the trunk, angled upward, and unwrapped the velvet. The photograph was sepia. The paper had softened at the edges, but the image had held. A young woman of perhaps 30, dark hair pulled back at the nape, a plain dark dress with a lace collar, and in her arms, half seated on her lap, half standing at her side, a small boy of perhaps 5. His hand rested on her wrist. His eyes looked at whoever had held the camera as though he already knew the picture was a goodbye. Along the lower edge, in a hand that had not yet learned to be frightened of itself. 4 words in ink: Caterina and Salvatore. Olive Grove, 1958. Lorenzo climbed back up the narrow stairs with the frame held carefully against his chest. At the mouth of the storehouse, he turned it so Sophia could see, and so Emma could see, and so that Sebastian, who had not moved from the doorway, could see it too. Rain gathered along the old man's shoulders and had begun to fall in slow single drops from the edge of his coat. Emma looked at the photograph. Then she looked at Sebastian, and she said, in the plain, small voice of a child who had not yet learned what mercy required a person to leave unsaid, "The boy in the picture has the same eyes as that uncle." Sebastian did not answer. Inside the pocket of his coat, the olive wood crucifix his mother had pressed into his palm 67 years ago felt heavier than it had ever been. Alberto Fanti went back down the stone stairs and knelt beside the tin trunk. The hinges gave way with the reluctant sound of metal that had forgotten how to move. Inside, the contents had been wrapped in oiled paper, folded with the neat, careful hands of a man who had known that damp would come for whatever he did not protect. Alberto lifted the first packet and unfolded it beneath the flashlight. He stopped breathing for a moment, then he called up the stairs, and his voice, always steady in a courtroom, had thinned into something close to a whisper. "Don Lorenzo, come and see." Lorenzo passed the photograph carefully to Sophia and descended again. He knelt beside the lawyer. The 2 men held the paper between them in the yellow beam of the flashlight. It was a birth certificate. The paper had yellowed to the color of old ivory, but the ink had held. Name of child: Salvatore Ricci De Luca. Father: Don Alessandro De Luca. Mother: Caterina Ricci. Date of birth: the 14th of June, 1953. Lorenzo read each line slowly, as though the words might rearrange themselves if he moved too quickly across them. Beneath the birth certificate lay another paper, folded once, its edges softer with age. He drew it out. The heading, written in the formal Italian of another century, read Record of the Family Honor Deliberation. The document was dated 1958. It bore 4 signatures: Don Alessandro De Luca and the 3 eldest men of the family council. The words were fewer than the birth certificate, and colder. In the name of the honor of the house, the surname De Luca was withdrawn from the child Salvatore. The child was to be removed from the estate. The mother was to receive support in silence. 4 signatures. 4 men, 1 boy, 5 years old, who had not been asked. Lorenzo climbed the stone stairs slowly, the 2 papers held between his palm and the flat of his other hand. Alberto followed with the trunk half open behind him. Isabella was already crying without sound. One hand had risen to her mouth and stayed there. Marco stood a step apart from her, his shoulders locked, his jaw working around a word he could not find. Lorenzo did not raise the papers. He did not lift them into evidence. He simply held them and turned toward the doorway of the old storehouse, where Sebastian stood in the rain. "Sebastian," Lorenzo said. His voice was low and slow, and empty of the usual authority he wore over it like a coat. "Who is Salvatore?" Sebastian did not answer at once. The fine rain traced clean lines down both sides of his face. On the cheek closest to the light, one line moved differently from the others, and no one in the doorway could have said with certainty whether it was rainwater or something else, because after 72 years, a man's face learns to hide even from itself. He was silent for a long time. Long enough that Marco's breath caught. Long enough that Isabella lowered her hand from her mouth. When Sebastian finally spoke, his voice had lost the smooth surface it had carried through 6 decades of service. It came out of him rough, as though something had been dragged across the inside of his throat. "Salvatore," he said, "is the name I buried with my mother the day she died in 1998. Isabella broke fully then. She turned her face into the wet shoulder of her coat. Marco did not move. He did not speak. His mouth opened once, then closed, and stayed closed. Sophia's arm tightened around her daughter. Emma looked at Sebastian, and her small brow drew together in the way children's brows do when they cannot understand a sadness but can feel that it is close enough to touch. They returned to the library in a silence that had lost the courtesy of the earlier one. The rain outside had begun to slacken, but the light through the tall windows had gone the color of ash. Someone from the household had stirred the fire in the marble hearth while they were out in the grove, and it burned higher now, throwing warm light across the walnut table where the letter, the ledger, the map, the photograph, and the 2 folded papers from the tin trunk now lay in careful order. Lorenzo did not go to the head of the table. He walked to the armchair beside the hearth, the one his father had used, and he laid his hand on its worn leather back. Then he looked across the room at Sebastian, who was standing again in the posture he had held for 60 years, and he spoke without raising his voice. "Sit down, Sebastian." The old man did not move at once. "I have never." "Sit down." Sebastian crossed the room slowly. He lowered himself into the second armchair by the fire, the smaller one, the one Don Mateo had reserved for the priest during Christmas visits. His hands did not know what to do. They found each other in his lap and stayed there. For the first time in 6 decades, he sat in the presence of the De Luca family as a man and not as a servant. He began to speak. His voice was low and steady, and it carried only as far as it needed to. His mother, Caterina Ricci, had come to work in the house at 17. She had been the youngest of 3 daughters from a village outside Palermo. Don Alessandro had taken notice of her in the 2nd year. He had been kind, at first. Kindness, Sebastian said, was the door through which all the other doors are found. He himself had been born on the 14th of June, in 1953. His mother had been 20. For the first 5 years of his life, he had run through the corridors of this house as any child of the household ran. He had known Don Alessandro's hand on the top of his head. He had not yet known what a surname was. At 5, the honor discussion had been held. He had not been in the room. He remembered only the smell of cigar smoke afterward, and his mother's face when she came out. They had left the estate that same night, with a suitcase and a small envelope of money and an address in Brooklyn. The house in Brooklyn had been paid for. The schooling had been paid for. Everything had been paid for. Everything, Sebastian said, except the name. His mother had died in the winter of 1998. After the funeral, he had come back to the estate and asked for a position. Don Alessandro, then old and often ill, had given him one without asking why. Sebastian had wanted only to be near his father in the last years of that father's life. Don Alessandro had died in 2004, without ever, in any room, before any witness, saying the word son. Sebastian stopped there. He did not speak of the voice on a satellite phone in a locked cellar room. He did not speak of a promise made 20 years ago in a warehouse near the docks. He did not speak of the slow bottle whose contents had been added, drop by careful drop, to Don Mateo's evening wine for 11 months. Those things stayed inside him, heavier than the crucifix in his pocket. Isabella wiped her cheeks with the heel of her hand. Sophia held Emma close and did not know she was crying. Marco spoke last. His voice was hoarse. "So," he said, "you are our uncle." Sebastian did not answer. He lowered his head. The house had grown quiet by the time Lorenzo gave up on sleep. The clock in the front hall had struck 2, then 3. The rain had stopped at some point without his noticing, and the silence that followed it was the deepest kind, the silence of a large house that had exhausted itself. He rose, dressed without turning on the lamp, and went down the stairs to the library. The fire had burned low again. The codex lay where he had left it, open on the walnut table, half of its pages still unread. He sent a guard to the housekeeper's quarters with quiet instructions. Sophia arrived a few minutes later in a wool robe, her hair loose against her shoulder, Emma asleep in her arms. Lorenzo apologized in a voice so low that the sleeping child did not stir. "I would not have asked at this hour. Only, there are pages the book has not spoken yet, and I think I need to hear them before morning." Sophia looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at her daughter. Emma's hand was curled in the collar of the old bear. "She will do it," Sophia said quietly. "But only what she can, and then I will take her back to bed." Lorenzo nodded. It was the first small mercy he had granted anyone that day. Emma was set on the tall chair. She rubbed her eyes with a small fist. Then she placed her hand on the codex and turned toward the back of the book, past the middle, past the pages she had already read, to the pages that were near the end. The ink there was different. The symbols were pressed harder into the paper, as though the hand that had drawn them had been in a hurry and afraid of that hurry. The lines wavered slightly. Some of the marks had been retraced twice. Emma read slowly. Her voice, small already, had grown smaller with sleep. "Do not trust the servant," she said, "who smiles too long. He counts every silver spoon, and every year he was denied." Lorenzo read the sentence back to himself. Then he read it again, then a third time. He turned his head toward the double doors of the library. They stood half open. Beyond them, in the corridor, a single lamp had been left burning at the far end. In its yellow light, Sebastian was polishing the pendulum clock that had once belonged to Lorenzo's grandfather. His cloth moved in the same small, patient circles it had moved in for 30 years. He looked, from that distance, exactly like a butler who could not sleep and had chosen to be useful. Emma placed her finger on the next cluster of marks. "He was a son first," she read. "Then a shadow. Then an enemy. Watch the tea he brings." Something cold slid down the back of Lorenzo's neck and settled at the base of his spine. He did not move. He did not call for a guard. He did not even turn his head from the doorway. He only reached, quietly, for the small brass bell on the corner of the table. the one that summoned Alberto Fanti from the guest room, where the lawyer had chosen to spend the night. Sophia lifted Emma, already asleep again, and carried her out through the side passage that avoided the corridor with the clock. When Alberto arrived, Lorenzo spoke in a whisper. He gave 3 orders: double the guards on his own quarters, contact Dr. Giovanni before dawn, quietly, at his home number, not the estate's, and prepare, without noise, a small case of what a physician might need if a household were poisoned. Then Lorenzo sat alone in the library with his hand on the codex and his eyes on the low fire. Sebastian left the corridor just before 4. The pendulum clock had been polished long past the point of need. He did not look back at the library door. His quarters were in the basement of the West Wing, a small suite of 2 rooms that the butlers of the De Luca house had used for a century. He locked the door behind him, drew the heavy curtain across the single high window, and stood for a moment in the middle of the room with his eyes closed. Then he crossed to the writing desk in the corner. He knelt. He drew out the bottom drawer, lifted the false wooden panel beneath it, and took from the hollow beneath a small satellite phone whose casing had gone gray with age. The phone had 1 number in its memory. He pressed it and lifted the receiver to his ear. 3 rings. Then a voice on the other end, deep and unhurried, thickened by cigars and by the middle of the night. Salvatore, Don Romano, you do not call unless the hour has come. The hour has come. Sebastian's voice was low and quick. He spoke in the practiced shorthand of a man who had made this call many times in his head, and only a handful of times in a locked room. The codex had been read. Almost all of it. A child had done it. A housekeeper's child, 3 years old, and no one had believed it could happen, but it had happened. 2 pages remained. Lorenzo had begun to look at him differently. Dr. Giovanni had been called. Guards had been doubled without noise. The last page would speak by tomorrow evening, and when it did, Sebastian's name would be pronounced aloud in a room he could not survive. I need the gates opened at first light, he said. You cannot wait another day. Victor Romano laughed. The sound was not warm. It rolled out of him like something practiced. Do not worry, Salvatore. Tomorrow the blood of the De Luca will pay you back for everything they took from you. You will sit in the chair of Don Alessandro before the sun goes down. I will handle Lorenzo, Sebastian said. You only handle the gate. You will handle Lorenzo, Victor repeated, as though the words were a small favor he was granting. Rest tonight, old friend. Tomorrow the house that closed its door on a boy will open every one of them to you. The line clicked. Sebastian set the phone gently back on the desk. He did not see, and could not see, the room on the other end of that line. He did not see the leather chair in which Victor Romano sat, or the 2 men standing beside it, or the way Victor set the receiver down and lifted a glass of red wine to his mouth without hurry. He did not hear Victor say, to the closer of the 2 men, in the flat tone of a man giving instructions about a livestock shipment, De Luca blood is De Luca blood. There is no clean kind and no dirty kind. Tomorrow we finish the name, every drop of it, including the one holding the knife for us. He did not hear the second man laugh softly and answer, yes, boss. He did not hear the wine set down. He knew none of this. He crossed his small room and drew the curtain aside. The olive grove lay black and quiet beyond the glass. Somewhere among those old bent trees, a 5-year-old boy had once walked out of a house with his mother, holding her hand. Sebastian reached into the pocket of his coat and drew out the small olive wood crucifix. He touched it to his lips. His voice, when it came, was no louder than the breath that carried it. Mama, tomorrow I bring your name back. A man who trusts his enemy has already forgotten that hatred, too, is a business. Morning came in gray. The rain had thinned again to a fine mist that clung to the tall windows without quite falling. Lorenzo had not left the library. Alberto Fanti had gone to make the calls that could not be made from inside the house, and Dr. Giovanni had arrived through the service entrance before dawn and was waiting in the small study across the hall. The codex lay open before Lorenzo on the walnut table, turned to the last page. He had not touched it. He wanted the child to be the one who read it. He wanted the child to be safe. The doors of the library opened, and Sebastian entered. He carried the morning tea tray with the same balance he had carried it for 30 years. On the tray sat the small white porcelain cup with a thin band of gold along its rim. Lorenzo had used that cup since he was 10. Sebastian had chosen it himself, on the day the boy had turned old enough to drink tea beside his father in the mornings. Morning peppermint, Don Lorenzo, Sebastian said. His voice was even warm in exactly the measured way it had always been warm. Just as you like it. Lorenzo did not look up at first. His hand closed around the cup by habit. The porcelain was warm. The tea smelled the way it had always smelled. Then he lifted his eyes. He held Sebastian's face for a moment too long. In his mind, Emma's small voice, from the night before, was still turning over on itself. Watch the tea he brings. But there was another voice in him too. older and louder, a voice made of 34 years. It was the voice of a man who had been carried up these stairs at 4 with a fever, who had learned to sit a horse in the north paddock with Sebastian's hand steady on the bridle, who had been driven to school every morning for 11 years by a man who had never once forgotten to check that the boy's tie was straight. Trust does not die from one sentence read by a child at midnight. Trust dies more slowly than that. Trust was still, in that moment, stronger than the codex. Lorenzo drank. The tea was warm and clean and tasted of the mornings of his childhood. He set the cup down and returned his eyes to the last page. Sebastian did not move. A minute passed, then another. Then Lorenzo's hand began to shake. It was not much at first. It could have been cold. Then the cup, which he had picked up again without thinking, slipped from his fingers and struck the edge of the table. It shattered against the walnut and fell onto the Persian rug in 3 pieces, the gold rim broken across the pattern. Lorenzo tried to stand. His knees gave. He caught himself on the table with both palms, and then his head lowered slowly, without will, onto the open codex. Down the hall, a small voice cried out. Emma had been walking toward the kitchen at her mother's side. The library doors were half open, and through them she had seen the man who had spoken to her the night before, the man who had a codex in front of him and a small white cup, fall. "Mama!" She broke from Sophia's hand and ran into the library. She was 3 years old, and she had no strategy. She climbed onto the chair beside Lorenzo, and put both small arms around his shoulders, and cried into the back of his suit. Sebastian stood beside the table. His hands had folded before him without instruction. His face gave away nothing. But something inside his chest, older than his hatred and quieter than his plan, cracked at the sight of Emma's small hands on Lorenzo's shoulders. He had been that child, once, holding a body he did not want to be holding. He turned. He walked out of the library. At that moment, the first gunshot cracked open the front gate. The first shot was answered by a second, and the second by a dozen more. The front gate of the DeLuca estate, iron and older than most of the men now firing on it, gave way in a low tearing sound that carried across the wet lawn and into every room of the house. Marco was on the ground floor when it happened. He had not slept either. He had been standing by the window of the front parlor, watching the drive without knowing why he could not turn away from it. When the black cars came up the road faster than any morning delivery had a right to move, he shouted once for the captains of the house, and drew his weapon before the last echo of his own voice had finished. Whatever quarrel Marco had held against his elder brother the day before belonged to a different world now. He ran into the entry hall and took the north wing with 6 men. He was hit in the shoulder in the first exchange at the courtyard door. He did not stop. He gave orders through a jaw locked against the pane, and the guards, who had never quite liked him, and who found in that moment that they did, after all, obeyed. Isabella, in the upstairs sitting room, dialed the private numbers of 2 allied families in succession. Both lines returned only a dead tone. She dialed a third. The same silence. Someone, somewhere, had cut the estate off from every voice that could have come to help. She set the receiver down with a hand that had gone very steady. Fear had passed through her and out the other side. Down the corridor from the library, Dr. Giovanni had already heard the shots. He grabbed the leather bag that Alberto Fanti had summoned him with in the night. The bag that held the small, dark bottle Lorenzo had, out of an instinct he could not have named at the time, asked to be prepared in case one day it is needed, and he ran. He crossed the doors of the library at a run that no man of his age ought still to have been capable of. Emma was still climbing on the chair beside Lorenzo. Alberto Fanti had reached them a moment earlier and was holding Lorenzo's head up from the codex. Sophia stood behind Emma with both hands pressed to her mouth, and when Giovanni came in, she said only one word, "Please," and stepped back to give him room. The doctor's hands moved without the tremor his voice carried. He tilted Lorenzo's head, checked the pupils, opened the small bottle, and administered what was in it drop by drop, with the practiced ease of a man who had prepared for this all night. "Take the child," he said to Sophia. "Now. Anywhere. Now." Sophia lifted Emma into her arms. She ran through the side passage to the kitchens at the back of the house. She locked the door from the inside with a key she had not known she remembered was on the ring. In the great hall, beneath the crystal chandelier, Sebastian stood at the foot of the wide staircase. Smoke was drifting in through the shattered front doors. Men in dark coats were coming through the smoke without hurrying. At their center walked Don Victor Romano, older and slower than his soldiers, wearing the winter coat of a country gentleman, and the small, unhurried smile of a man who had waited a very long time for a morning. Sebastian did not draw a weapon. He walked forward to meet him. "Lorenzo has fallen," he said. His voice was low, meant only for Victor. "The codex is in the library. We can take it now." Victor Romano smiled at him. The smile carried no warmth. He turned to the man at his right and gave 2 brief orders in a voice loud enough for the hall to hear. Search the house. Find the housekeeper and the child. Some men mistake the sound of gunfire for the sound of homecoming. Victor did not stop smiling. He turned toward Sebastian slowly, as though the movement itself was part of a pleasure he had promised himself many years ago. From the inside of his winter coat he drew a small, dark pistol, and he raised it, without hurry, until the muzzle rested a hand's breadth from the center of Sebastian's chest. Sebastian did not move. He looked at the pistol. Then he looked at Victor's face. "What are you doing?" His voice was quiet. It had not yet found the strength to be anything else. "We had an agreement," Victor laughed. This time the laugh was thin. It was the laugh of a man who had been waiting so long to say something that saying it had almost stopped being satisfying. "Salvatore," he said, "you are a DeLuca. DeLuca blood must die, even the blood they threw away. Did you truly believe I would hand you an empire because you carried a tray for 60 years? Sebastian stood very still. 20 years of hatred, of small favors traded through cold channels, of promises made in warehouses that smelled of oil and river water, of a plan carried by drops of poison hidden in a bottle of wine, of a single word carved into a wooden crucifix he had kissed the night before, collapsed inside him in the span of a heartbeat. He did not fall. He did not weep. He simply stood there and felt his life become smaller than he had ever imagined it could be. Victor did not lower the pistol. He spoke over his shoulder to the nearest of his men without turning his head. Everything from that library, the letter, the black ledger, the birth paper, the photograph, all of it into the fire before we leave this house. No one is to know the DeLuca line ever had another branch. We erase it clean. The man nodded. Behind them, at the far end of the hall, a door opened and did not close cleanly. 2 of Victor's soldiers came through, dragging Sophia by the arm. Emma clung to her mother's neck with both small hands. Emma was crying openly now. A high, thin, endless sound, and Sophia was trying to place her own body between the men and her daughter without ever letting go of the child. Sophia's hair had come loose. Her cheek was cut. She did not scream. She did not beg. She only turned her body, again and again, to keep her daughter behind her. Emma saw Sebastian. Her eyes, huge and wet, fixed on him for one long moment across the smoke and the ruined marble floor. Sebastian looked at her, and in the small, terrified face of the housekeeper's child, he saw a boy he had spent 60 years pretending not to remember. A boy of 5, walking out of this same house with his hand in his mother's hand, not knowing yet what a name was, not knowing yet that the shape of a door closing behind him would become the shape of every hour of every year of the rest of his life. Something inside him, older than his hatred, stood up. Victor did not notice. He was already speaking. "The child first," he said, in the flat voice of a man giving domestic instructions. "Then the mother. Then Sebastian. Lorenzo last, if he is still breathing when we finish here." One of the soldiers, a younger man with dark eyes and a steady hand, raised his weapon and turned the muzzle toward Emma. Sophia let out the first sound of her whole morning, a low, wounded, animal sound, and pulled her daughter down against her chest. Sebastian did not think. He had done enough thinking for one lifetime. Sebastian moved faster than a man of 72 had any right to move. From the inside of his left cuff, from the place where a butler was never meant to carry anything sharper than a cloth, he drew a small silver knife with a bone handle. He had carried it there for 20 years. He had polished it every Sunday morning. He had never yet drawn it in a room where he might be seen. He drove it into the back of Victor Romano's gun hand. Victor screamed. The pistol dropped and rang against the marble floor. The soldier with dark eyes turned his weapon by reflex toward Sebastian, but the reflex cost him half a second, and half a second was all Sebastian needed. He was already moving toward Sophia and Emma. He seized Sophia's elbow with his left hand and Emma's small waist with his right, and he pushed them both, hard and without ceremony, toward a wooden door tucked beneath the curve of the great staircase. It was a door that the DeLuca children had passed 1,000 times without noticing. It looked like a servant's closet. Sebastian had installed the lock himself, 40 years ago, on Don Alessandro's orders, and there was only one key. It was in his pocket. He turned it. He shoved the door open with his shoulder. Behind the door, a narrow stone stairway sank downward into darkness, into the entrance of a network of tunnels that a builder in 1892 had carved beneath the estate, for reasons that had once been political and had since become forgotten. Sebastian bent close to Sophia's ear. Smoke stung both their eyes. "Go east. There is a door at the end that opens into Lorenzo's bedroom. Do not stop for anything. Do not answer any voice." Sophia looked at him for a fraction of a second. It was long enough. She turned and ran. Emma pressed against her chest. Into the dark. Sebastian closed the door and turned the key from the outside, then broke the key in the lock with a downward twist of his palm. The lock could still be forced, but it would take time, and time now belonged to the small feet of a housekeeper's child running through stone. He did not go back into the great hall. He went the other way. He went back to the library. Dr. Giovanni had propped Lorenzo half upright on a wheeled trolley pulled in from the medical closet. Lorenzo's eyes were still red, his lips were still pale, but he was awake, and when he saw Sebastian in the doorway with blood on his cuff, he did not lift a weapon. Sebastian crossed the room. He knelt beside the trolley. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not deserve it, and he knew that asking for it was itself a kind of theft. He said only, "Forgive me, or kill me. Either, but first, let me help you save the child." Lorenzo looked at him for a long time. Whatever a man's eyes could carry, they carried in that look. Poison, 34 years, an olive grove, a small white cup, the sound of his father falling at dinner 2 months before. Then, slowly, something else. "Go first," Lorenzo said. "I will follow." Sebastian rose. He crossed to the third bookshelf on the west wall and pulled a book that no one in the family had ever chosen to open. The shelf swung inward. He led them into the second entrance of the tunnels he had mapped alone for 60 years. Redemption does not erase what a man has done. It only decides what he does with the time he has left. The tunnel was narrower than a corridor. The stone walls held a cold that no season could warm. Small oil lamps had been fixed into iron brackets every few meters, and though most of them had gone dark years ago, Sebastian had lit them again during his private walks through this passage, one by one. Over the years, no one had noticed he was absent from his post. He knew every step of it. He had counted them all in the dark. He led Lorenzo, Alberto Fanti, Dr. Giovanni, and the 4 remaining guards down the main branch of the tunnel, the branch that ran east. Somewhere ahead of them in the same dark, from the opposite entrance, Sophia and Emma were running toward the same point. At the junction, where 3 stone corridors met beneath the center of the house, the 2 groups came together in a small circle of trembling lamplight. Emma broke from her mother's arms before Sophia had even fully stopped. She ran across the stones on legs too short for the distance, and threw both arms around Lorenzo's neck. She did not speak. She only held him. Lorenzo lowered his face against her small dark hair, and held her back with the arm that was not braced against the wall. Sophia broke against Alberto Fanti's shoulder in the way a woman breaks when she has spent an hour refusing to. The moment lasted the length of a breath. At the far end of the eastern branch, behind them, wood splintered. The locked door beneath the staircase had been forced. Victor Romano's voice came down the stone in short, ragged commands, and behind his voice, footsteps. 4 men came into the junction after him. The gunfire began at once and had nowhere to go. Bullets struck stone and threw sparks the color of small stars. The narrow air filled with a smoke that did not disperse. 2 of the DeLuca guards fell in the first exchange, one silently, one with a single sharp cry that ended before the sound reached the ceiling. 3 of Romano's men went down in the answer, 1 by Lorenzo's hand and 2 by the older guards who had served Don Matteo in a different war. Victor was still standing. His right hand was wrapped in a red cloth. His left had taken up the pistol. He steadied it against the stone wall. He aimed for Lorenzo. Lorenzo had turned his body sideways over Emma. His back was toward Victor. He could not see the pistol lifting. Sebastian saw it. He moved. He crossed the 2 meters between them without any grace at all, and he set his own chest in the line the bullets would take. 3 shots. The first entered high in his chest, the second lower, the third caught him in the side of his belly and turned him half around, and he fell to one knee, then to both. Lorenzo turned. He fired twice. He did not miss. Victor Romano struck the wall behind him and slid down it and did not move again. At the far end of the tunnel, another set of running footsteps. Marco, pale from his own wound, arrived with the reinforcements he had gathered from the north wing. Together they turned back toward the main floor of the house and finished what remained of the Romano men in the great hall above. The chandelier still hung. The estate still stood. The DeLuca house was full of smoke and blood, but its walls were where they had always been. In the tunnel, Sebastian was on the stones. His breath came in short, wet catches. His hand had found the front of Lorenzo's coat and was holding it, gently, the way an old man holds the sleeve of a boy he has known since the boy was small. The gunfire above had gone quiet. What came through the stone now was only the sound of men moving with less urgency, footfalls of a house being reclaimed by its own. In the small lamplit circle of the junction, no one moved except the doctor. Sebastian lay on the stones. The black of his butler's coat had darkened further, unevenly, along the chest and the side of the belly. His hands, which had spent 60 years being placed exactly where they were meant to be, had lost their placement. One had fallen open at his hip. The other still held the front of Lorenzo's coat. Lorenzo knelt beside him. He slid his hand beneath the old man's head and lifted it gently onto his own thigh, the way a man lifts something that has already broken but might still be carried. Dr. Giovanni worked over the wounds. After a moment, his hands slowed. Then they stopped. He looked at Lorenzo and did not say what did not need to be said. Sebastian was still breathing. Barely, but he was breathing. His right hand let go of Lorenzo's coat and moved, unsteady, up the inside of his own jacket. He drew out from the small inner pocket a folded piece of paper. The paper was thin and yellowed and worn at the creases. It had been folded and unfolded many times over many years. He held it out. Lorenzo took it. He did not open it at once. He passed it, without lifting his eyes from Sebastian's face, to Alberto Fanti. Alberto unfolded the page under the trembling light of the nearest oil lamp. On its surface, drawn in an old, careful hand, were the last symbols of the codex, the ones that had never been in the book because they had been torn from it and hidden inside a coat pocket for more than 20 years. Emma stepped forward. Sophia held her hand. The child looked at the marks. Her voice, when it came, was very small, but it did not waver. She translated the symbols one at a time, in the way her grandfather had taught her, and Alberto read the words aloud as she gave them, until the sentence stood whole in the tunnel air. To the DeLuca who reads this last, forgive the first son. He only ever wanted a name at the table. He was not born a traitor. He was made one by silence. Sebastian's eyes had grown unfocused. He turned his head, with what strength he had left, toward Lorenzo. His voice was almost gone. It came out in pieces. All my life. I only wanted, once, to hear my family, say my name. Lorenzo took the old man's hand in both of his own. Something in him, something that had not moved since the night he had stood in a hospital corridor 2 months earlier and watched the sheet drawn up over his father's face, gave way. Tears he had refused to spend on any witness fell now onto the back of Sebastian's cold hand. His voice broke on the word he had never used. Uncle Sebastian. Sebastian smiled. It was not the polite smile of a servant. It was not the practiced smile of a man carrying a tray. It was the first true smile his face had made in the 60 years he had served this house, and it belonged to a child of 5 who had finally been called back inside. Emma slipped free of her mother's hand. She bent and picked up the small olive wood crucifix that had fallen from Sebastian's coat when he had taken the bullets. She placed it carefully, with both small palms, into his open hand. Sebastian closed his eyes. The oil lamp above him flickered once, and then held steady, and did not go out. 3 weeks had passed. The DeLuca estate had been repaired in the quiet, thorough way that houses of that age are always repaired. The front gates had been rehung on their old hinges. The bullet marks on the marble had been polished until the stone remembered them only as small shadows in certain kinds of light. Out in the olive grove, the hatch beneath the old storehouse had been sealed with new mortar, and above it, a young olive tree had been planted where the ground had been broken open. Lorenzo stood at the head of the great hall on a clear afternoon of late autumn. The captains of the family were there. The heads of the 3 allied houses were there. Isabella stood at his right shoulder in a dress the color of dark wine. Marco, his arm still bound beneath his jacket, stood at his left. Lorenzo did not speak from any prepared paper. He spoke plainly, in the voice of a man who had spent 3 weeks learning how to say true things aloud. The name of Salvatore Ricci DeLuca would be entered into the family record, next to the name of Don Alessandro, in the same ink as every other DeLuca who had lived and served. The old laws of blood honor, the ones that had once allowed a 5-year-old boy to be walked out of this house at night, were finished. They would not survive one more generation. The long war with the Romano family was over. What remained of the Romano house had surrendered its arms and signed a peace at Alberto Fanti's table. And in the memory of the woman who had raised a first son alone in a small house in Brooklyn, a foundation would be built in the name of Caterina Ricci, to care for children whom the world had not thought important enough to name. In the family chapel, later that afternoon, Emma stepped carefully up to the altar with Sophia's hand steady at her back. She placed the small olive wood crucifix on the white cloth, beside the newly painted portrait of Uncle Salvatore Ricci DeLuca, whose face, at last, was allowed to hang in the house that had once refused him. Sophia and Emma did not leave the estate. They stayed, not as staff, but as family, welcomed by name at every table. In the library that evening, Lorenzo stood at the tall window. The codex lay open before him. This time he did not read from it. He lifted a pen, and in his own careful black ink, he began to write the first line of a new chapter. This story reminds us that truth does not depend on age, on rank, or on power. Sometimes the person who sees most clearly is the one everyone else has overlooked. A true family is not built on blood alone. It is built on the courage to name what was done wrong and to return dignity to those who were once denied it. If you were Lorenzo, would you have forgiven Sebastian? And in your own life, has there been someone who waited far too long for a single word of recognition and never received it? Please share your thoughts with us in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please press the like button, subscribe to our channel, share this video with someone you love, and let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching from today. We wish you and your family good health, gentle days, and the courage to speak the truth when it is time to speak it. See you again in the next story, where a powerful man will discover that the woman he has loved for 10 years was never quite the person he believed her to be. A house built on silence will one day be inherited by the child brave enough to speak. And that, perhaps, is the only true inheritance worth passing on.